From the Psych Hub Podcast Network, welcome to Coming Back Better, a podcast sponsored by HCA Healthcare and in collaboration with Columbia University Department of Psychiatry.
Well, welcome back, everyone, to a new episode of Coming Back Better. And I'm joined today by my co-host, Marjorie Morrison. And hey, Marjorie, what are we talking about today?
Hey, Paul, great to be back. Today, we're talking about a subject that I've always been really passionate about, which is introversion and extroversion. But before we dive in, let's do a just for fun, completely non-scientific quiz.
This is my favorite type. Okay, cool. So Marjorie, we put together some statements and our listeners will be given two statements at a time, an A and a B, and they can listen which one do they more relate to or which one describes them better. And then at the end, we'll do the big reveal of which one show you're more extroverted or introverted. How does that sound?
All right. I'm excited to do this, especially because I'm pretty sure I already know what I am. But let's get started. So tell me, which is more true for you? I am seen as outgoing or as a people person. I am seen as reflective or reserved.
Okay, we have our first pairing. I'll go on to the next. A, I feel comfortable in groups and I like working in them. Or B, I feel comfortable being alone and I like things I can do on my own. All right, back to you, Marjorie.
All right. You guys ready for another one? I have a wide range of friends and know lots of people. I prefer to know just a few people well.
All right, next up. I sometimes jump too quickly. Oh, this one's too close to home. I sometimes jump too quickly into an activity and don't allow enough time to think it over. Or B, I sometimes spend too much time reflecting and I don't move into action quickly enough.
And finally, before I start a project, I sometimes forget to stop and get clear on what I want to do and why. Or I sometimes forget to check with the outside world to see if any of my ideas really fit the experience.
All right, drum roll, please. These are pretty obvious at this point. A statements, you lean more towards an extrovert, and B statements say hello to introversion. Now, I do want to remind folks that these are just some simple statements, and talking to our experts, Marjorie, it was really fascinating to get a sense of what this is really about. There's a complexity and a depth here, well beyond these 5 statements.
I've always been a very clear extrovert, and people have often said about me, like, I'm the most extroverted person that they've ever met. And, really the way it's been described to me, it's like where you get your energy from. And it certainly isn't right or wrong. It's like, do you get your energy from people or do you need to kind of recharge and you get your energy from being sort of in that recharge state or being alone? I'm certainly not an expert into it, but it does really fascinate me. This whole kind of thing and how it's a spectrum. And it does make me laugh that I'm probably very, very, very much on one end of it.
Well, Marjorie, that's something we have in common. I remember many, many years ago doing Myers-Briggs, and I was pretty balanced in the middle. I don't remember all the different categories, but I do remember the introversion-extroversion scale. I was like as far extroverted as you can get. So I think we share that. But, when I've listened to these experts, I've realized that there were times that didn't fit. And I really got a good understanding about the why behind that, why it's not really one or the other.
I wonder when I think about COVID and how people were so isolated, right? We're quarantining. I wonder if initially it was harder for extroverts than introverts. I remember I have a friend who was an introvert and she was like, this is heaven for me. I don't have to go anywhere. And for me, I was like, this is not heaven. I'm curious if you've learned or you're learning about where there are people that were more inclined to do more Zoom happy hours or do virtual games with friends and things like that, just because they needed that sort of external social component. I'm curious how introverts and extroverts play out with COVID.
Yeah, our experts really brought some layers to this and how it wasn't necessarily a simple answer. I'm excited to first share with you, Dr. Beta Rivas is back. We had spoken to her previously. And if you remember, she's a faculty member in the counselor education program at California State University, Sacramento, specializing in marriage, couple, and family counseling, clinical mental health counseling, and addiction counseling. And I walked away really having a sense of there's more here than just either or. And to your point about along this spectrum or continuum, there were different challenges, but also opportunities during COVID for folks.
I remember Dr. Rivas. She is awesome. I'm really interested and looking forward to hearing what she has to say. Let's take a listen.
Well, I am so excited to welcome back one of my favorite subject matter experts, Dr. Beta Rivas.
Oh, Paul, it's so good to see you again. This is a lot of fun. So thanks for having me back.
Sure. I'm always big on definitions to make sure we're all talking about the same thing. So, what do we mean by introversion and extroversion?
Oh, gosh, that's kind of a tricky one, right? Because it's a spectrum. Those are terms we've heard that kind of explain parts of our personality in relation to how charged we are by other people.
Okay.
So I kind of think of it as we're all kind of on this spectrum experiencing different levels of how we relate to other people.
And I'm wondering, being a spectrum, like as an individual, how fluid are we depending upon situation and context along that spectrum?
It depends on the environment. I tend to have more extroverted qualities. And so the profession that I'm in, like I'm a faculty member, I mean,
Okay.
that's really needed. But I have a lot of colleagues that have more introverted qualities.
Mm-hmm.
So they like to joke this term of like more extroverted introvert. And I don't want to label anyone with one. I think we've had this habit of kind of identifying with a label. So I don't like to use
Okay.
that. I like the spectrum because in a lot of our work environments, maybe we have to be a little bit more on.
Sure.
I may have more introverted qualities, but I can lecture.
Okay.
I can be on a podcast. I can be in large crowds and feel comfortable doing it, but I kind of tap out, for lack of a better term. It gets exhausting.
So we can step up, maybe if someone's more introverted, they can step up and function more extroverted, but then there needs to be, you pay a bit of a cost that you need to recover.
To recharge, so to speak.
Okay.
All of our batteries are a little bit different, right? Like I may have more charge for activities being around people because it feeds me.
Okay.
But even I feel
Mhm.
like I hit a wall sometimes where I just need to kind of recharge my battery. So I kind of think of it as our batteries look a little bit different.
And of course, I'm thinking Myers-Briggs. I think that's maybe the most common place we come across. And I know when I did Myers-Briggs, I was like off the charts extrovert. So surprise, I'm doing a podcast. But there are even times where it's like, I'm done with people. So I get the impression that recharge happens for everyone, wherever you fall on the continuum.
Exactly. I just may have a higher tolerance for being in those environments than someone who identifies or needs more time alone. And so there's less of a tolerance being in those environments. And Myers-Briggs is a really good one. Everyone's been on 16 personalities online, Enneagrams, True Colors. There's a lot of personality typing systems, and it's a really cool way to understand ourselves and other people. But it's only one part of who we are.
So now that I think we have a sense of the lay of the land when we're using these terms, how about during the pandemic? And how did folks on the different parts of the continuum, how did we get impacted during the lockdown, during the pandemic?
I think the memes going around at that time were a really good reflection of that. I think some people who tend to lean more introverted or tend to have more introverted qualities enjoyed that time there was just more time to reflect and be in those kind of pods or in smaller groups that weren't as exhausting. So I think it was a reflective time where maybe people on the more extroverted side were really missing groups and being around people and connecting. I think it taught us all a lot about some of our personality traits. We had time to really reflect on it.
And maybe in some ways, being under more extreme conditions gave more light to this part of ourselves.
Yeah, that is the best way to put it. It gave more light. We had more time to really think about our hobbies, our habits, our personalities, like what really feeds us.
I'm also wondering, with having more virtual contact, how that was for folks at different points on the continuum. Is there anything worth noting there?
Having that virtual realm, I think there's this choice that kind of came with the pandemic where you could elect to hop onto Zoom or go or not go somewhere.
Okay.
And there was a good reason for it, right? Everyone was a little bit more cautious to begin with. So I imagine any individuals who lean more introverted were like, okay, this is a space where I feel like I'm not as pressured.
Maybe more acceptance.
Yeah. A little bit more awareness of it. And Again, the memes are the best way to kind of track.
Yeah.
There were a lot of people just kind of posting about that or getting really comfortable with that space of, I don't have to. No, we had to before.
Now that we don't have the same limitations, what are we seeing for folks, again, that lean more introverted, more extroverted as we don't have the restrictions?
That is such a good question. I'm curious what direction we're going to go because if you look at career, a lot of people, whether it was intentional or forced on them, changed careers. And that
Yeah.
is something that kind of played in with where do I want to live? What job meets my needs in that way? So maybe before, where we may have
Right.
leaned more extroverted or introverted, and that led us in a different direction, that could look a little bit different now.
Okay.
Or if we felt like stuck and this thing happened, everyone's job was impacted in some way. Now we have another set of kind of layoffs in different areas. So I think we've been in transition. And in part of that transition and having had that time to reflect, people have more choice. And do I want to be in an environment that meets my needs?
A thing that's come up in all these episodes is how disruption offers opportunity. And hearing that maybe when it comes to finding, again, it's part of my personality, not my whole self, but maybe now I actually have more choice to find something that fits me better in this area.
Yeah, whether it's, and we talked about relationships before, but now even in the work world and the environment that I spend most of my time in, does it give me something in return or does it take?
Where do I function best? And if I need more recovery time, maybe that's now not as hard to find.
Yeah, and that recharging the battery. What is work life balance? It's always been a challenge, right?
Right.
But in that vein, we're revisiting, self care
Mm-hmm.
and taking care of ourselves, knowing that there's nothing wrong with me if I get drained by being in an environment where I have to socialize for a long period of time.
Mm-hmm.
That's draining for individuals who lean more introverted. So it's a consideration in all of our world, right? And normalizing it's okay that I do that for a little while or I don't participate in that. Before we were really obligated. I may have to do this work function or this. I don't want to let my friends down or my family down. So I'm just going to do. And we kind of did and did and did. So I think moving forward, there's this. I'm curious where it's going to go because, right, we're in the middle of this. I suspect there's a little bit of I've reflected on my strengths, what is meaningful for me. I'm not going to do it out of obligation. And if I do, there's a little bit of myself I'm happy to give, but I have to have my time to recharge, so to speak.
And maybe that's being, again, the acceptance. That's me making a choice, less obliged, not acting out of duty, but acting out of choice. And maybe that's being met with more acceptance. Those two things are a positive collusion, maybe.
I think so, because we're talking about a lot more. We're talking about mental health. We're talking about personalities. We're talking about where we are on introverted and extroverted and thinking and feeling. And since we're talking about it naturally, that leads to having more acceptance and having it. I imagine the next part of that is having it unpack in our social and work world.
In your practice, I'm wondering, are you seeing any trends turning up as far as people reacclimating to socializing?
Interestingly enough, I think there's a lot of anxiety, and that's a term I don't want to use willy-nilly because it's a diagnostic term, but I think it's used a lot to describe worry or nerves or apprehension. I don't want to overinflate and use anxiety, but I've seen a lot more of that apprehension, a lot more of those nerves, a lot more worry.
Okay.
And that's definitely playing out in our world as we come back, whether that's will I fit in or how do I fit in or what am I obligated to do now? Because if I leaned more introverted, it was maybe comfortable working from home. Now, if I have to go back into the office, that's going to create a level of adjustment. If I lean more extroverted, gosh, I may be coming in full force. And there was this period where when we started to engage, and it's kind of still in process, where we didn't even know how to have those conversations you have just randomly. There was a lot of, are you understanding me? Am I making sense? Am I being odd? It's like we forgot how to socialize in mass. And now that we're coming back, that's not the issue. Now it's more, out of practice, maybe I think we're all looking for a little bit of that balance between acceptance and having my own space with balancing it with the responsibilities that we're obligated to. The way we're going, we're relearning some habits. We're relearning about how we fit into the world, figuring out what are my strengths and accepting other people, kind of recognizing their strengths and their challenges. That's the thing I love about, again, Myers Briggs is a good example. Enneagrams, really any personality typing, even if it's signs, they give you this opportunity to kind of reflect on your strengths and to understand other people's strengths may be different and to accept that, I may have more extroverted traits, you may have more introverted traits, and I get it. You're not avoiding me.
Wow, this whole subject is so interesting. Really about how introverts and extroverts are used to explain parts of our personality, but that don't really define us as a whole. And I love the idea of how your energy is affected by being with others. It's like the context brings out more introverted or extroverted qualities. Like, I love that, right? Just that sort of, what is that context that you're in that you have those qualities? And I also thought one of the key things was that it's just better to think about it as a spectrum instead of 100% label, even though I said I am a full on extrovert on one end of the spectrum. But I love that idea because sometimes I want to charge or whatever. So I really like that. And I like that notion that every person is a battery that just charges differently. And that I just think is so, so true. But the pandemic made us a lot more tuned in to what recharges our battery. And I think now there's just much more of an acceptance really about how to take time to recharge.
Yeah, and that acceptance piece really struck me as maybe we were so into autopilot and we assumed we had to do things. And I love how this reflection opportunity that the lockdown brought us and the fact that we were forced to make changes, but also reflect. And now maybe we can be a little more of a compassionate, welcoming society that if somebody needs recharge time, it's okay to have that time. It's not a personal reflection. It's just someone taking care of themselves. So we are off to a good start here with Dr. Rivas. Next, I talked to Amy Pearlman. And Amy is a licensed independent clinical social worker in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts with a Master of Social Work from Smith College. Her areas of expertise are in community and mobile crisis intervention for individuals and families, and she supports an integrated vision of healthcare throughout all community facets. And she had some similar themes to Dr. Rivas. And then I found there were some other real nuggets in listening to her and continuing to really bring out the complexity and the layers of this topic, moving beyond the labels. Amy, good to have you here.
Thanks, Paul. Good to be back.
Let's jump right in. The world suddenly had this radical shift where people didn't even have a choice to perhaps work from home. But I'm wondering about that radical shift and the impact it had on people on different ends of the continuum.
I really love that question and really putting I want to say our brains around that, but our hearts around it a little bit too.
Yeah, thank you.
And I think part of this to me starts to feel like when you talk about a pandemic or social isolation, that could be an introvert's dream come true. And I really feel like that's a bit of a myth.
Say more.
I read some articles around this, and people changed a bit of how they defined what an introvert and an extrovert were
Okay,
when they were by themselves more.
interesting.
Extroverts get their energy from being around other people. So they have the energy to be setting up a Zoom call, to stay connected.
Okay.
Introverts may not get so much energy. They may be exhausted from those types of efforts. And when those aren't built into their daily routines, it's that much harder to make the effort to do it.
Okay, that makes sense. Yeah.
That really resonated with me in terms of how much harder we all had to try during the pandemic to stay social while isolated. I think introverts need that social connection as well. They just may feel it differently.
Right, right.
Or in our introverted moments, we all may feel it differently.
I've heard some people talk about how the lockdown and the pandemic turned some extroverts into introverts. And I'm curious your thoughts on
I can relate to that one too.
that.
When it became harder and it was a lot of energy, even for extroverts, you're putting a lot of energy into
Okay.
being creative in how you're going to see people
Okay.
or being creative in terms of how you're interacting. It was a lot less built in daily interactions.
Okay.
So that felt more of a challenge. And I think that a lot of extroverts may have learned to relate more to their introverted part.
Okay. Yeah, yeah.
Knowing that you meditate, Paul, I'll kind of put it into this meditation
Sure,
metaphor to some
yeah.
extent. It's the more comfort that you can get with being at peace, quiet, tuning things out,
Mhm.
you're really cultivating that to some extent and really learning about ourselves amongst a continuum. So an introvert may learn,
Okay.
hey, after maybe 2 days of this, or maybe 2 weeks, or maybe 2 years of this type of
Yeah.
social isolation, it's enough for me. I need to get some energy from other people. And extroverts
Okay.
may have come to this component of, hey, I don't always need to be around other people. There's some energy within me and some different perspective or piece that I get from experiencing the world without all of the external stimuli.
I love that, this sense of we're complex beings and those 2 boxes weren't enough. And maybe that forced change invited me to look a little more deeply into this is not just an either or, that I may need different things at different times.
That really is what I think being human is about,
Okay.
is
Yeah.
in what situations do we need what?
Mhm.
It's getting to know ourselves in the situation of the pandemic, getting to know ourselves even when we don't want to.
When someone is more on the introverted side of this scale, how can they meet their introversion needs, if I can phrase it that way, without slipping over into too isolative?
I guess what I'm hearing from that question is, and I think it could be placed on the extrovert side too, is how do we balance out
Okay.
both sides of ourselves
Okay.
so that we get a good mix of introspective
Ah,
time
yeah.
and
Okay.
connected time?
I like that. Okay.
And I really think it's that balance to some extent
Mhm.
that comes with some self awareness. I was thinking about this in terms of an old job that I had where I am an extrovert. I process externally. I like am super transparent in terms of what I'm thinking. And I worked with someone who was very introverted.
Mhm.
She had been at the job for maybe 15, maybe 20 years, a long time. I started, and within my first month or 2, she became so frustrated with me, and she said, "You have told me to do 3 or 4 different things in the past half hour. Can you just make up your mind?" And in my mind, I really hadn't asked her to do a single I hadn't asked her to do one thing. I had no idea. She thought because in her mind, she came to a conclusion before she spoke it.
Okay.
In my mind, I very rarely come to a conclusion until I talk it through with someone else.
Mm.
The real change in our working together, and this is one of my favorite coworkers ever, was the moment where I had to articulate, hey, this is how I think. I never had this idea that people would perceive me as telling them what to do or making decisions that quickly. I mean, I just didn't have that kind of self awareness because I was so extroverted that I kind of thought everybody was extroverted.
Okay.
And she was so introverted and had never met someone so as extroverted as me. And
Okay.
we ended up having the best conversations because I started to pull the introverted side of myself to
Mhm.
think a little bit more before speaking out loud, and she pulled for the extroverted part of herself
Mhm.
in terms of talking things through together. And that blend really felt right to me. We used to talk about that a lot at leadership meetings when we were at the same job too and at the same agency, of how important it is to know yourself, the way that you are perceived,
Yeah, yeah.
the people around you, and to have that flexibility or malleability about when to use different sides of yourself. I think about it even in a classroom setting where,
Mhm.
the teacher's asking the students, for those of you who speak a lot in class, let's try to make room for people who don't speak as much.
Mhm.
And for those of us who don't speak as much, let's try to think about how you could contribute in the conversation today.
Right.
And I like having that intention depending on yourself and the group you're in.
What I love about that story is it moves beyond this labeling, which introversion, extroversion, so often, the conversation is just take a little quiz, which am I, and it's over. And hearing that extroverts and introverts need to have conversations like this, I'm thinking in families, friendships, and teams of how do we pull the strengths forward here? This full continuum, let's make sure we're leveraging all the strengths.
I think it's almost like when you're in a friend group and one friend is the one who's always making the plans,
Hmm.
that may be the person who gets energy out of making
Right,
plans.
right.
And it may be someone else who still wants, there may be someone else in that friend group that still wants to stay connected,
Hmm.
but doesn't have the energy for actually getting all the ducks in a row to get out.
Closing thoughts, and I recognize, we're still in these early days post-pandemic, but I'm just wondering, maybe some guidance for folks who may be sort of struggling with returning to new normal, for lack of a better term, and maybe they did learn a bit more about themselves on this continuum. What suggestion or encouragement do you have?
I think the kind of suggestion would be almost that kindness that you give to others, give to yourself.
Nice. Yeah.
Be aware of labels, and I think that could be a whole other topic, Paul.
Yeah.
But be aware of these labels and the expectations we have for ourselves to be a certain way when we may not feel that way
Mhm.
that day. We may have transformed throughout the pandemic or through other life stressors or through other life
Mhm.
celebrations.
Nice.
There may be different things in our lives. There will be different things in our lives that change us,
Okay.
and that we don't have to fit into this box of introvert or extrovert.
Mhm.
I would encourage people to get to know themselves well enough to know where they can find the right level of balance and what does it feel like when the balance is off, to encourage
Mhm.
where do you want your energy to be? How do you want your energy to flow? And I would not fight it. I would try to schedule a balance of time where you have enough time to yourself and enough time connected to others so that you can kind of play around with that balance in getting to know yourselves.
That was another really interesting conversation. It's just another example how it's not black and white. You don't have to be one or the other, but rather you might pull traits from each personality type depending on the environment. There can be a pressure, right? Which is like associated with the label of an extrovert when you're feeling more introverted, like when you're sick. And I think the same goes the other way. People might feel bad that they're an introvert. I love what she talked about how the labels can be damaging and that it's better not to be so black and white.
Yeah, I loved her story about when she was with that previous coworker, and there was this almost filtering of perspective that she was more extroverted, and she didn't realize that her sort of processing out loud was overwhelming for thinking the other woman and thinking these were directions being given. And the fact that it was through conversation, they understood each other better and found how to sort of call upon the extrovert called upon kind of some introvert qualities, and then the more introverted woman called upon extroverted. And I really started to relate that, yeah, there's times that even though I am an extrovert, there's times I don't want to be around people. And making that okay with myself, Even though that whole part about expectations, that once you're labeled an extrovert, people just assume you want to be go, go, go. And it's like, no, sometimes I just want to curl up and have some me time.
Agree. And isolation might have made introverts crave more social interactions than before, and extroverts might have learned to enjoy being alone and getting joy from outside of external stimuli. We all just need to be aware of how people perceive you, how you perceive yourself, and then taking time to get to know yourself. And in what situations are you more of an introvert and an extrovert?
Yeah, my takeaway is really not getting stuck in that label and giving space to myself and others, that we all move along this continuum, like you said, depending upon the conditions or context. So I feel a little freedom here now. Just because I think I'm an extrovert, I can be an introvert at times too.
Yeah, it's giving people, right, sort of the grace or the permission to kind of be whatever they are, but then also knowing when you need to get charged and how to do it and what fulfills it. So like going back to the battery, I really love that. This was a great episode. Thank you, Paul. I love these topics because I just feel like everybody can relate. Everybody's on that spectrum.
So to those introverts out there, good to have you. We need you just as much as us extroverts.
Everyone, I hope you'll join us next week. Our topic is another topical one, which is finances and mental health. I hope you join us and have a great week in the meantime, and enjoy either recharging on your own as an introvert or recharging around people or somewhere in the middle. Have a great week.
Thanks, Marjorie. Bye, everyone. If you'd like to reach us, you can do so at podcast@psychhub.com. To be notified of new episodes, don't forget to like, subscribe, or follow wherever you're listening. And reviews are so helpful, so please do leave one if you can. It will allow others to find us and join along. Coming Back Better is executive produced by Jacob Morrison. It is produced and edited by Juliana Castro. The series was developed in collaboration with Linda Rosenberg, Carla Cantor, and Kristen Watson from Columbia University Department of Psychiatry, and Manisha Shah, Dr. Frank Drummond, and Amy Rushton from HCA Healthcare. Research is assisted by Melissa Leaf. Show artwork was created by Arnella Gengoli and Ashton Smith. Audience strategy is by Alyssa Fackler, Sarah Hale, and Alyssa Yarama. A very special thanks to Andrea Womack, Trevin Stegall, Evelyn Valentine, Kaylee Sneed, Julie Plummer, Thad Thomas, Paul Kay, and Elizabeth Roosevelt. Coming Back Better is a co-production from Psych Hub and Columbia University Department of Psychiatry and is brought to you by HCA Healthcare. I'm Paul Dager, and my co-host Marjorie Morrison and I thank you for joining us. See you next week.